Have you ever imagined that a simple letter could hold the key to a series of murders and conspiracies? Well, what seemed like a trivial case has turned into a massive and terrifying mystery capable of transforming your entire sense of security in your daily life. If you think these kinds of cases only happen in movies, get ready. The story of the poisoned letters will show you how reality can be scarier than any fiction. This case, which shook French high society in the late 19th century, reveals something much deeper than simple murder. It's a psychological game where power, manipulation, and death insidiously intertwined, moving invisible pieces on the board of a great mystery. And believe me, you'll be surprised by the details that haven't yet been revealed. I invite you to subscribe to the channel, like it, and comment what you think, because throughout this story you'll discover much more than you imagined. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't miss any details of this enigma. I remember exactly the first time I heard about the poisoned letters case. I was leafing through the files of an old case in France, and among so many investigations lost to time, one in particular stood out for its boldness and mystery. It was the late 19th century, a turbulent period for European society, marked by revolutions and the birth of new technologies. But what was happening in the shadows of Paris seemed even more intriguing. Seemingly harmless letters were becoming the vehicles for a routinely disguised murder. The first victims were prominent figures of high society, a class that believed itself immune to the dangers of everyday life. Businessmen, politicians, and even royalty began to fall, one after another, with similar symptoms: extreme weakness, intense pain, and ultimately death. It was no coincidence. Something was happening in Paris, and no one could figure it out. A city that prided itself on its prestige now faced a silent fear, where any letter could spell a tragic end. But what really struck me in those first pages of the investigation was the silence of the authorities. At the time, the police adopted a traditional and somewhat bureaucratic approach. And although poison was likely responsible for the deaths, no one knew exactly what substance was being used. I wondered, how could something as simple and everyday as a letter become the main weapon in such a deadly mystery? What followed as part of the investigation revealed a fascinating paradox: the combination of a city full of elegance and sophistication with an invisible, relentless threat. And as I progressed, I realized that the mystery wasn't just the deaths. There was something more, an even greater plot behind it all. And who was behind it? That's what I was about to discover. But that answer would lead me to another, even deeper mystery. The investigation intensified immediately after the first signs of poisoning, and what seemed like a series of isolated deaths quickly turned into a nightmare of epic proportions. I remember walking into the police office where reports were scattered across the desk, and everyone was talking in whispers, trying to connect the dots between each new case. Something was very wrong, but no one could pinpoint the connection between the victims until a crucial piece of evidence emerged. A letter. Just one letter, discovered by chance on one of the victims, would be the key that would unlock everything. It was an ordinary letter, with no indication that it was any different from the others. But upon closer inspection, experts discovered something peculiar. The letter's paper had a strange texture, and a subtle, almost imperceptible stain in the corner of the page. In the laboratory, analysis revealed the presence of prussic acid. The poison was deadly in small doses, and the mystery was beginning to make sense. But how on earth could someone poison a letter and get it to the recipient without arousing suspicion? That was the question that tormented me. Now, what surprised me most was the coldness with which the victims received these letters. Many of them had no idea of the impending danger. It seemed that in those days, a letter in hand was just another note in the mail. But what no one knew was that in that envelope, the fate of a life was sealed. The fact that until then no one had noticed the poison made me reflect how many other crimes had been committed this way without anyone even considering what was happening. And so the investigation became increasingly intriguing. Each letter that arrived seemed like a piece of the puzzle. But what I didn't imagine was that by putting these pieces together, the story would take a completely unexpected turn. Just when I thought I was close to a conclusion, I realized something much larger and darker lay behind it. But I didn't yet know what this meant for the future of this investigation. It was when I investigated the method of crime that everything began to make more sense and at the same time became even more terrifying. The poison used, prussic acid, was indeed a rare but lethal substance. The most interesting and at the same time disturbing thing was realizing how something as simple as a letter could be transformed into a deadly weapon. I thought about how many letters were sent every day around the world, full of information and words, but none of them carried such imminent danger. That ordinary correspondence seemed harmless, but it was laden with a poison capable of destroying lives. The letter-sending process was meticulous, and whoever orchestrated it knew exactly what they were doing. The poison was imbued into the letter almost imperceptibly. When handled, the substance would come into contact with the victim's skin, causing death before the person even realized what had happened. During the investigation, I came across reports of victims who felt a tingling sensation in their hands but dismissed it. They were so accustomed to receiving letters that they never imagined one of them could be fatal. The coldness of the method left me perplexed. It wasn't just a matter of poisoning someone, it was about sending an invisible message, one that went unnoticed until the last moment. There were no obvious signs that anything was wrong. It made me think of how many crimes throughout history have been committed with methods so sophisticated, yet so subtle that they went unnoticed, almost as if the criminal were playing a game of hide and seek with the victims' lives. This kind of thing didn't happen by chance, it was being done on purpose. And so, with each new detail uncovered about the method, the question that kept ringing in my head was, who would be capable of orchestrating something so calculating? Someone cool-headed enough to plan every step and choose a weapon as silent and lethal as a simple letter. But the answer to that question would lead to an even greater surprise, one that would send the whole story into an unexpected twist. When the investigations began to point to a female figure, I confess I was surprised. Women at the time were not often seen as responsible for such calculated and sophisticated crimes, especially in a poisoning case where coldness and precision were essential. But the evidence began to accumulate and Mademoiselle de Montarville's name began to emerge strongly. Her name was linked to a network of contacts and relationships that in everyone's eyes placed her as a prime suspect. But something in her behavior told me there was more to this story than a simple accusation. She was a high-class woman, with access to all circles of power and influence. Many saw her as a typical Parisian society lady, but those who knew her story knew there was more behind her charming facade. Mademoiselle had a complicated past, a series of relationships with influential people, and a remarkable ability to manipulate those around her. However, something about those first encounters with her didn't feel right. There was an excessive calm, a coldness in her gaze that didn't match the woman she presented. For some time, she denied any involvement, claiming to be the victim of a conspiracy. She claimed to be the target of a network of betrayals, but as the investigation progressed, it became clear there was something much deeper to the story. What intrigues me most is that as the investigation brought her closer and closer to being the main perpetrator, details about her life emerged that revealed a pattern. She seemed to be constantly present at the locations where the poisoned letters had been sent, as if she were somehow observing everything, but maintaining a safe distance, as if waiting for the right moment to speak out. It was at that point that I realized she was playing a much more complex game than I'd imagined. Mademoiselle de Montarville wasn't just a criminal, she was a chess player, moving invisible pieces around everyone. Yet there was something about her that made me think she might be a victim in a much larger game. This doubt led me to investigate further, which would reveal something that would change the entire narrative of the case. The victims were crucial to understanding the mystery. It was as if each one had been handpicked, not by chance but for a much deeper reason. Some names immediately caught my attention, as they belonged to Paris's elite, influential businessmen, politicians, and even royalty. At first it seemed the deaths didn't follow a clear pattern. However, as I analyzed the cases in more detail, something began to stand out. All the victims shared an indirect link, a hidden connection that would only become apparent upon closer inspection. These weren't just random deaths, but parts of a much larger plan. I remember visiting the place where one of the victims lived, a large apartment in the heart of Paris. I was trying to understand what these people had in common. The strangest thing was that they all seemed to be in positions of power, and it seemed their deaths were bringing some kind of benefit to someone. But who, in their right mind, would have an interest in killing these people? The answer wasn't yet clear, but the pattern was there, forming like an invisible network between the victims. And the most curious thing of all is that in each case, the poisoned letters arrived at decisive moments in each of their lives, almost as if their fates were already sealed. The way each of them received the letter, the way they reacted, and, of course, the closeness of their relationships with key figures in society all seemed to indicate that the target of these deaths was not just the person themselves, but something larger that was being manipulated in the shadows. During one of the interviews with a survivor, he said something that stuck with me. I felt like the letter had something to do with the moment in my life. It wasn't just any letter. This made me wonder if the victims were somehow chosen based on the impact their deaths would have, as if each of them were a crucial piece in a macabre game. As the investigation progressed, I began to realize that these deaths weren't just the end of a life, but the beginning of something much larger. Something that would unfold in even more complex ways and make me see Parisian society in a completely different light. But what I didn't yet know was that, as I dug deeper into this mystery, new victims were about to be revealed, and the web of connections behind the deaths would expand even further. I was beginning to feel trapped in the investigation, caught in a tangle of clues and possibilities. When you're faced with a case like this, you need the help of people who understand not only the crime but also the society surrounding it. It was then that a key figure entered the scene. The first investigator, a woman named Madeleine Dupont, was the one who began to shape the chaos. Madeleine was no ordinary detective. She was meticulous, a true force of nature when it came to investigating complex crimes, and her clinical eye for the details of the poisoned letters brought a freshness to the investigation that I hadn't encountered before. At first, the collaboration was a bit uncomfortable. Not because Madeleine was difficult to deal with, but because I felt she was getting closer to the truth faster than I could. It was a chess game, and she was way ahead of me. She believed that to solve the case, it was necessary to understand more about the people involved, about the victims' social circles. It wasn't enough to simply identify the poison or follow the letter's trail. Madeleine was convinced that the key lay in the relationships and invisible connections that united the victims, and I, who had a more direct approach, had to swallow my pride and start following her lead. The most fascinating part of working with Madeleine was her ability to connect the pieces. Each time she showed me a new piece of evidence, I felt like a veil was being lifted from my face. And little by little, we began to realize there was something bigger at play. Something beyond a simple series of murders. Madeleine, with her keen eye for detail, began tracking the mail and identified a pattern. The poison-penned letters were being sent at strategic times. But what did this mean? This wasn't just a random attack, but a long-term strategy, and whoever was behind it knew exactly what they were doing. Collaborating with Madeleine was the turning point I needed. With her by my side, I felt like answers were finally within our reach. But as we progressed in the investigation, the discoveries began to pile up at an alarming rate, and the truth that emerged was far more frightening than I ever imagined. But the most shocking thing was yet to come. The truth about who was behind it all. When we finally identified the poison, I was in the lab with Madeleine watching the scientist analyze the substances found in the letters. The tension was palpable, and for a moment, it seemed like the entire investigation revolved around that small detail. The poison used, prussic acid, was as rare as it was lethal. Just a few drops could kill a person in a matter of minutes. And most intriguingly, it was a nearly invisible poison, something not easily detected, even with the most accurate tests, unless you knew exactly what to look for. I was surprised to discover that at the time, few people knew about the substance, and it wasn't widely available. So how did someone manage to slip it into the letters undetected? The discovery was a real turning point in the case. Prussic acid, a poison known in chemistry but rarely used in murders of this nature, had been applied with impressive precision. It made me wonder about the intelligence and preparation of whoever was behind this. This was no ordinary person. This was someone with a deep knowledge of chemicals, someone who understood science but also knew how to use fear and surprise as weapons. And worst of all, no one was safe. A letter could carry death without anyone realizing it, and no matter how hard the police tried, there was no way to guarantee anyone's safety until they discovered the source of this deadly poison. What intrigued me most was that the substance was not only lethal but also a symbol of the criminal's cunning. Using prussic acid was a statement of power. It was a deliberate choice, something that showed the criminal had mastery over what he was doing. He wasn't just poisoning people, he was controlling the timing of their deaths, deciding who would live and who would die in a way that seemed as cold and calculating as the poison itself. This made me realize that somehow the deaths of these victims were being orchestrated much more profoundly than we imagined. But as the police focused on the poison, I knew the real mystery was yet to come. Prussic acid was the tool, but who was manipulating the cards? How did this person know where to find this rare substance? And most importantly, why was this person choosing to kill in such an indirect and subtle way? As the answers emerged, the plot deepened. And soon, we discovered that this was not just a crime of murder, but a much more complex power play. When the first arrest was made, I found myself more lost than ever. Juliette Pichon, a seemingly ordinary woman, was arrested on charges of being an accomplice. At that moment, the investigation took an unexpected turn. I had already begun to wonder if we were really looking in the right direction, because Juliette didn't seem like the kind of person with the cold-bloodedness to orchestrate something so calculated. But as we began to look deeper, a web of complications emerged. Juliette wasn't alone, and I knew it. She might be a pawn, but she wasn't the centerpiece. What bothered me was the fact that Juliette, before her arrest, had been a woman with no prior record, someone no one would suspect of being part of something so grand. She had blended seamlessly into the Parisian scene, known to everyone but with a well-hidden secret. Interrogations revealed little about her direct involvement, but there was something in her story that didn't add up. She was trying to protect someone, or rather something, and that was what made me doubt Juliette's arrest. Wasn't it too simple? Her arrest seemed like a superficial solution, as if someone were trying to close the case without identifying the real culprit. As Madeline and I tried to understand the complexity of the case, we began to discover that Juliette was in contact with influential people. She was not only involved in the deaths, but had possibly been used as a pawn in a larger game. Most disconcerting was when one of the letters she had sent was found with a unique identifying mark. It wasn't just a riddle, it was a code, something that hinted at much more going on behind the scenes. But who was behind this game, manipulating everyone like puppets? Juliette was just another piece, a piece likely to move on an even larger board. What I didn't know was that Juliette's arrest wouldn't bring us definitive answers, but rather more questions. With each detail that emerged, the plot thickened and the path to the true culprit seemed to grow further away. I knew that arrest wouldn't lead us directly to the truth, but the twist was about to catch us off guard. I never imagined the investigation would take this turn. Just when everything seemed to be falling into place with Juliette arrested and the evidence pointing to her, something completely unexpected happened. During a routine examination of the letters that had been sent, a detail that had previously gone unnoticed stood out. Something that seemed trivial but now made all the difference. The marks on the letters, which previously appeared to be just ordinary impressions from the mailing, were actually a coded signature. A signature no one had noticed before, but which, upon closer inspection, revealed something deeper. The name behind this code wasn't Juliette, but rather the name of someone much closer and with deeper ties to the victims than we imagined. When this discovery was made, the twist in the case was almost like a sharp blade cutting through everything we thought we knew. The real culprit was closer than we thought, and much more integrated into Parisian society than anyone could have imagined. The revelation threw us into a new abyss of suspicion and questioning. This was no longer an isolated crime, but a meticulously orchestrated conspiracy. From that moment on, the pieces began to move more quickly, but not in the direction we expected. It was at this point that the investigation led me to one of the most immersive encounters of my career. I was at a reception at the home of one of the victims, a large gathering of political and social figures. And there, in that setting, I realized that the letters and the poisons weren't the only dangers lurking. There was a game of manipulation underway, where every move was precisely calculated. The casual conversations, the superficial smiles, everything seemed to hide much darker secrets. Something told me the criminal wasn't just one person, but a network of figures that until that moment had remained completely hidden. The truth, however, was about to reveal itself in an even more shocking way. With the discovery of this signature and the twist in the case, the clues began to lead us to a final confrontation that until then seemed impossible. A truth that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the poisoned letters case. But to understand what was really happening, we would need to delve even deeper into the shadows. What awaited us was something I could never have predicted. As the investigation progressed and more pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, an increasingly complex pattern emerged. Madeline and I became increasingly convinced that the poison letters case was not simply a local crime, but part of something much larger. During a secret meeting with police officers, a revealing piece of information emerged. The victims were connected not only to each other but also to international interests. I was beginning to realize that this systematic poisoning was part of a global network of conspiracies involving politicians and business people from several countries. What appeared to be an isolated crime was in fact being orchestrated by a web of influence that spanned borders. Most surprising, however, was the fact that the international connection wasn't anywhere obvious. It wasn't about grand alliances or espionage conspiracies, but rather hidden economic interests behind each victim. Each seemed to be linked to a major company or an ongoing financial transaction, leading us to believe the poisoning was intended to destabilize these businesses or even destroy careers that were threatened by something larger. I found myself pondering how power can be manipulated in such subtle ways, with careful moves that no one even notices until it's too late. The truth is that the case wasn't simply a series of murders, but an international power play where the cards were merely a means to an end. This made me reflect on how easy it is for those at the top of the chain of command to manipulate the cards and gamble with human lives without anyone even noticing. The big question that began to form in my mind was, who was really behind this? Was it a faction with economic interests, or perhaps a network of political corruption that expanded beyond the borders of a single country? As the details unfolded, the magnitude of the conspiracy became even clearer. This wasn't just a murder case, it was an international operation disguised as isolated crimes. I knew we were close to the truth, but the closer we got, the more elusive it became. And as much as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, the end of this mystery still felt distant, as if a curtain were slowly being lifted, revealing something much larger than any of us could have imagined. I knew that in a case like this, the media would play an important role, but I didn't realize how much it could complicate the investigation. Newspaper coverage started out simple but quickly turned into a frenzy. Each new death, each poisoned letter became a front-page headline. The media had an incredible ability to construct narratives, and soon the poisoned letters case became more than just a criminal investigation. The story took on a life of its own, fueled by public curiosity and the thirst for quick answers. But at the same time, this media attention was creating distractions, diverting authorities from focusing on what really mattered. What bothered me most was how the media seized on the information instead of reporting the facts accurately. Headlines began to fill the pages with speculation and unfounded theories. This was creating tension. As with each new article, the pressure on the investigators increased. The media wasn't concerned with the truth, but with ratings. And this made our work more difficult. I found myself facing a two-front battle. One, to uncover the truth, and the other to combat the false stories that were spreading throughout the country. It was as if the case was being shaped more by popular imagination than by the reality of the investigation. Media pressure was causing authorities to make hasty decisions, forced by public expectation. Journalists, in their relentless pursuit of information, began interfering at crime scenes, trying to find clues before investigators arrived. This not only hindered the progress of the case but also created an environment of chaos where everything was subject to speculation. I, accustomed to working in silence without the pressure of cameras, began to feel that the investigations were being distorted by the urgency imposed by the media. And as the headlines grew, the mystery became deeper and more difficult to solve. It was then that Madeline said something to me that stuck with me. The media isn't looking for answers, it's looking for a story. And it made me reflect on the truth at the heart of it all. Were we so obsessed with finding a culprit, an easy answer, that we were losing ourselves in the process? The media had distorted reality so much that instead of clarifying the case, we were more confused than ever. But the truth, as always, was somewhere between the lines, waiting to be discovered. And eventually, the media, with all its noise, would have to be silenced in the face of the truth we would find. Parisian high society, with its elegance and glamour, seemed the perfect setting for a mystery like the poisoned letters. But as I delved deeper into the investigation, I began to see the true face behind this sophisticated facade. Those who presented themselves as the most respectable, the most unattainable, were in reality immersed in a culture of intrigue, manipulation, and power games. It was as if Paris were the stage for a play, where each actor had a carefully rehearsed role, but everyone was deep down playing a game far dirtier than anyone could imagine. Those who lived in the luxurious apartments and frequented the gala ballrooms were often the same ones connected to shady companies and business practices. As we connected the dots between the victims, one thing became clear. The deaths were linked to internal power struggles. These struggles weren't just about money, but also about influence and control. Poison wasn't just a weapon of assassination, it was a tool of manipulation, used to weaken those in a position to challenge the status quo. I found myself beginning to understand that the real war taking place here wasn't just between the victims and the perpetrator, but between factions within society itself. I was beginning to question everything I thought I knew about the elegant world of high society. Appearances were just that, appearances. Beneath the layers of luxury and wealth lay a relentless struggle for supremacy, where every move could mean the rise or fall of a career. And it was in this shadowy game that poison became the primary currency. It was a society where power and manipulation were so intrinsically intertwined that for a moment I began to wonder, was everyone involved somehow? But what I feared most was realizing that this kind of culture wasn't confined to Paris. It was a global reality where money, politics, and the elite were willing to do anything to maintain their place at the top. The deaths weren't an anomaly, they were part of a web of control that extended far beyond the city limits. As I began to understand this, the poison letters case transformed from a simple criminal investigation into something much more complex and profound. And as the details unfolded, I knew we were about to uncover something that would forever change our perception of what happens in the shadows of power. As the investigation progressed, the truth began to reveal itself in an even more disturbing way. Conflicts of interest were at the heart of everything. Each new suspect, each new detail that emerged, pointed to a game where motivations were far more complex than simple personal issues or revenge. In high society, alliances were made and broken in a split second, and as I discovered in a tense conversation with Madeline, everything was interconnected. Business, finances, power relations, all were part of an invisible network where any threat to the status quo could be eliminated without hesitation. What disturbed me most was the realization that these deaths were not simply matters of murder, but strategies of destabilization, calculated maneuvers to weaken positions of power and ensure order was maintained. It was during one of the meetings with the police officers that we began to see how the pieces fit together. Some of the victims were somehow involved in business dealings that threatened powerful interests, and soon the truth emerged. There was a conspiracy to neutralize those poised to make major discoveries or changes that would upset the balance of power. To me, this meant the killers weren't just killing. They were acting as a kind of invisible force, removing pieces from the board, cutting off heads to ensure nothing changed. I wondered how many other people had been removed from positions of influence without anyone even suspecting murder. It was a political game, but played in the shadows, where the poisoned cards were merely a reflection of a much larger movement. The most intriguing thing about all this is that when you're in such a big game, the lines between right and wrong begin to blur. Those involved were often so covert, so immersed in the system, that neither Madeline nor I knew how much we could trust the information we were being given. Who was playing on our team? It was impossible to know. Everyone seemed to have something to gain from the deaths, and it made me question, how far were people willing to go to protect their interests? And most importantly, who was truly in control of this narrative? I found myself trapped in a shadow game, where the only certainty I had was that no one was playing fair. But the biggest revelation came when we discovered that this power network was not composed of just a few individuals, but of entire groups, with intersecting interests and a long-term strategy. The poison, the manipulation of victims, it was all part of a more elaborate plan. What seemed like a simple case of mysterious murders was in fact an invisible battle for power, where every move by one player could result in lost lives. But who was really behind it? Who orchestrated it all with such precision? The answer was about to be revealed, and it would lead us to a discovery even more terrifying than any we had encountered before. As witnesses began to emerge, I realized how much more complicated this case was than we'd imagined. The problem with investigating something like the poisoned letters case was that the people involved, even those closest to the victims, seemed afraid to speak out. It wasn't just fear of reprisals, but a deeper fear, as if they knew that by getting involved in the case, they could be swallowed up by a much greater force. The first witnesses we interviewed were suspicious, reluctant to share any information, and try as we might, the truth always seemed one step ahead, as if we were playing a guessing game. But gradually, some witnesses began to offer small details that, though seemingly irrelevant at first glance, began to connect. It was one witness, a woman who lived in the same building as one of the victims, who gave me the most valuable clue to date. She spoke of something no one else had mentioned, the presence of a mysterious figure who roamed the neighborhood but never appeared in public. She said she had seen this person several times leaving the victim's home before her death. But what she didn't know, and what drove me to pursue a new lead, was that this man wasn't unknown. He was somehow connected to one of the city's major businessmen, which only added to the complexity of the case. The big question now was how these witnesses could help us solve the mystery. I was beginning to realize that to understand the enigma behind these deaths, we needed to go beyond the surface. Each witness, each account, held a piece of the truth, but no one seemed able to see the whole picture. That's when I realized that perhaps the secret lay not in the big clues, but in the small remarks, in the seemingly trivial observations. And it was with these small observations that we began to piece together the puzzle. Over time, the witnesses began to open up, and the pieces began to fall into place. But the most surprising thing was realizing that the true answers didn't come from the grand revelations, but rather from the forgotten details, from the words spoken between the lines. It was as if the poisoned letters case were a story being told piecemeal, and each witness was just a part of it. The problem now was how to connect these pieces and get to the truth without being sidetracked by the many obstacles that presented themselves. As the investigation deepened, what appeared to be a series of murders orchestrated by a single perpetrator soon evolved into something much more complicated. A network of accomplices began to emerge subtly but steadily. The initial clues, which pointed to a single person responsible for the poisoned letters, were far from telling the whole story. Each new detail that emerged seemed to indicate that there were more involved, more hands working behind the scenes, manipulating everything with frightening precision. Most disconcerting, however, was the realization that this network of accomplices was not only associated with the direct victims but extended to a deeper layer of society, involving influential individuals who seemed harmless at first glance. I remember when one of the key witnesses, a former employee of one of the victims' companies, revealed something that made me stop and think. He said he knew of secret transactions, of negotiations that were taking place outside of legality, and that some of these agreements were being used to ensure that certain people disappeared without a trace. The most disturbing part was when he suggested that the strategy of poisoning the letters was a way to prevent those threatening these transactions from making moves that could jeopardize the business. The message seemed clear: disappear or you will be removed. This made me question how many of these deaths were actually part of a larger game, where the value of lives seemed to be determined by one's ability to stay in the game. As new evidence emerged, it became increasingly clear that the network of accomplices was incredibly well coordinated. They included not only people with financial interests, but also those with political and social power, who saw the killings as a way to solve problems that arose in their path. What struck me most was the consistency of the killings. It wasn't an isolated crime, but a strategy being implemented with astonishing coldness. And most disturbing of all, the accomplices were so well hidden that until that moment, most of society had no idea who was truly behind it all. They were moving in the shadows, pulling the strings with precision, and no one suspected that they were the true archetypes of an unprecedented conspiracy. With that, the questions began to pile up. Who were these people? How many others were involved? And most importantly, what would be the next move for this network of accomplices? Each discovery we made seemed to only deepen the mystery, as if we were delving deeper into a maze of conspiracies where each clue led us to something even bigger. What once seemed like a simple series of murders was transforming into a complex game of power and manipulation, where human lives were merely pieces on a much larger board. As the details of the case began to unfold, I found myself increasingly obsessed with a simple yet disturbing question: who could orchestrate something so meticulously calculated? Throughout my investigative career, I had dealt with murderers and ruthless criminals, but nothing prepared me for the mind behind the poisoned letters case. What fascinated me was the precision and coldness with which each death had been planned. It wasn't just about killing someone. It was something deeper, more twisted. With each step I took deeper into the investigation, I realized that the criminal mastermind behind it all was playing a long-term psychological game. The idea of using cards, a seemingly harmless object, as a tool of murder was a brilliant and, at the same time, disturbing move. The criminal not only planned the murders, but also knew how to deceive society. He knew no one would suspect a simple letter. It wasn't just an act of revenge or a desire for power, but a calculating way to manipulate the emotions and reactions of those around him. He was playing on fear, on the idea that no one was safe, even in the most everyday things. And what impressed me even more was the way he maintained control. The criminal was always ahead of everyone, always calculating every move like a chess master. The most intriguing thing was realizing how the criminal mind in the poison letters case was so intimately connected to the psychology of the victims. They weren't chosen randomly as I initially imagined. Each victim seemed to be a piece on a psychological chessboard, someone who somehow had a connection to the criminal, whether through their social standing, business dealings, or relationships. What appeared to be a simple death or even a series of murders was actually a psychological game where the criminal manipulated the emotions of everyone around him. And the most disturbing thing was the fact that he was doing all this without arousing suspicion, remaining in the shadows, observing the reactions of the victims and society. As I began to understand the complexity of this criminal mind, the investigation took a whole new direction. It was no longer just about catching a criminal, but about understanding his psychology, his deepest motivations. What was he after? What did he want to prove? Maybe he was simply having fun, or maybe he was trying to make a statement about power, life, and death. But no matter how hard I tried to understand, one thing was clear: the criminal's psychology was as elaborate as his murders. He was manipulating everyone, even the investigators, like pawns in a game we still couldn't fully understand. As we began investigating the true origin of the letters, I realized they weren't just a vehicle for the poison, but essential pieces of a much deeper mystery. The seemingly simple letters became symbols of the very game the criminal was playing. Over the months of investigation, I discovered that the letters weren't chosen at random. Each envelope was meticulously prepared, not only to conceal the poison, but also to deceive and manipulate the emotions of those who received them. The impression I had was that by sending these letters, the criminal was communicating with his victims in a unique and personal way, as if challenging them to discover what lay behind those words. What struck me most was the standardization. Each letter had a format, a writing style, and somehow always carried a touch of familiarity. I began to wonder, how could someone be so precise, so calculating, to the point of transforming something so trivial into a deadly weapon? The mystery of the letters lay not only in the poison they contained, but in the psychological game they played. I found myself trying to understand the criminal's reasoning. He wanted the victims to know what was happening, but at the same time he wanted them to feel powerless to react. The letters were like a disguised sentence, a daily reminder that control was in his hand. It was in one of the last letters we analyzed that the true symbolism began to emerge. Upon opening the envelope, I noticed that the letter's paper was subtly imprinted with a symbol, something that seemed insignificant at first glance, but gave me insight into the criminal's mind. He wasn't just killing. He was creating a narrative, a story where he, the criminal, was the protagonist. He saw himself as the director of a tragedy, manipulating each scene, each act, with impressive precision, and it seemed he was observing how each victim would react, as if he were writing a book where the readers, in this case the victims, didn't yet know the ending. As I began to piece together the mystery of the letters, it began to make more sense. The perpetrator wasn't just destroying lives, he was leaving a legacy, a mark, a mystery for anyone who dared to investigate. And as the letters multiplied, I knew we were getting closer to the truth, but also closer to confronting the mastermind behind it all. Because ultimately, this mystery wasn't just about who was sending the letters. It was about what they represented, an unprecedented manipulation of life and death. I was already beginning to feel the pressure. The clues were leading us to a dead end, and with every step I took, the truth seemed to move further away. It wasn't enough to simply identify the accomplices or the victims. I needed to find the mastermind behind it all, the mastermind orchestrating this grand scheme. And as in any good investigation, the pursuit of the true culprit became an endless maze where every seemingly correct clue turned out to be another false one. I knew that behind every letter, every death, lay a cold and meticulous mind. But who was this person? Who was behind this network of manipulation? My first suspicions began to emerge when I examined the deeper connections between the victims. They weren't just random victims, they were all somehow connected by a common thread. It wasn't just about personal revenge or money. The true motive seemed to be rooted in something more psychological and philosophical. The perpetrator wasn't just killing, he was creating a story, constructing a narrative where he was the sole master. He controlled the game, he controlled the outcome. And as we tried to piece it together, I realized he was always one step ahead, watching every move, playing the game masterfully. Each encounter, each conversation with witnesses seemed to take me further away from the true answer. The criminal was so well hidden that, even with all the clues, it seemed impossible to identify him. But then, in an unexpected twist, we began to realize that the clues were all there, right before our eyes. The true criminal mastermind wasn't hiding behind masks or disguises. It was revealing itself, but in such an insidious way that no one noticed. The psychological game was so well executed that I, as an investigator, was also being manipulated, as was everyone around me. The pursuit of the true criminal mastermind became a mental battle. It was a chess game where my every move was countered with a smarter, more calculated one. But I knew that eventually he would make a mistake. Even the most cunning criminals leave traces, and even a small detail would be the key to solving everything. I was determined to find him, and finally realized that what I was searching for wasn't a single culprit, but a mind that controlled every move, orchestrating everything from the shadows. And soon I would be face to face with it. When we finally got to the truth about the perpetrator, the revelation was as unexpected as it was terrifying. The man behind it all was no one I suspected. Initially, I'd focused on a number of people, powerful, influential figures, but the truth that emerged was far more surprising. The perpetrator wasn't a criminal mastermind with a murky past. He was someone who at first glance didn't fit the profile of a cold, calculating killer. The mastermind behind the poisoned letters was, in reality, someone much closer to home than I could have imagined. Someone who was somehow infiltrated in every circle I believed to be safe. The big revelation, however, lay not only in the criminal's identity, but in the reason behind his actions. Throughout the case, I had believed there was a financial or political motive, but when I spoke to him for the first time, I realized his motivations were much more personal. The criminal wasn't just trying to kill people, he was trying to prove something. He wanted society to realize his capacity for manipulation and control. Each poisoned letter, each death, was a way to demonstrate his power over others, a way to challenge the world and make everyone fear him. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted to leave a mark, to create a legacy. The conversation I had with him was one of the most disconcerting of my life. He didn't seem remorseful. In fact, it seemed he took indescribable pleasure in revealing his vision of the power game. He saw life and death in a distorted way, as if everything were just a chessboard where he moved the pieces at will. The poison, the cards, all of it was part of a larger plan, something he'd been plotting for years. He didn't see himself as a criminal, but as someone who was simply exposing society's weaknesses, challenging the idea of order and justice. He believed that by doing so, he was exposing the system's true fallacy. In the end, the scariest thing was realizing he never intended to be caught. He knew what he was doing all along, and even though the clues were right in front of us, he had orchestrated everything with such mastery that it seemed impossible to unmask. The poisoned letters case to him was nothing more than a masterpiece, a masterstroke. And looking at him, I realized the real game wasn't about capturing him, but about understanding what he represented: the dark side of power and control, where human lives were nothing more than disposable items. After the case was solved, I found myself reflecting on the impact the poisoned letters case had not only on the investigation but also on culture itself. What seemed like a macabre mystery, a series of murders, ended up becoming a symbol of how power and control can be manipulated in such subtle yet destructive ways. The criminal, despite being captured, left an indelible mark on history. And this mark wasn't just in the details of the case, but in the way he challenged the established order, showing how even the most secure institutions can be destabilized by a single strategic move. What haunts me to this day is how the fear he sowed still resonates, even after his capture. The legacy of the poisoned letters case is also reflected in the way crimes are viewed in society. It transformed the idea of a simple murder into a matter of psychological control, of mental manipulation. Until then, few cases had shown how death could be treated not just as an end but as a power play. This changed the way many began to think about complex crimes and made me realize that often, the most dangerous thing is not what's on the surface, but what lies hidden between the lines. Investigations and psychological analyses of crimes began to focus even more on the criminal's mind, behavior, motivations, and how all of this intertwines with society. But the impact went beyond police or criminology scholars. The poison letters case became a cultural touchstone, cited in books, films, and even in debates about how power can be wielded in insidious ways. It was no longer just about the poison itself, but about how it represented something much larger: the manipulation, control, and influence of elites over ordinary lives. It became a case study in the limits of power, in how often the most powerful are able to orchestrate destruction in nearly invisible ways without anyone noticing until it's too late. What struck me most, however, was that the case served as a lesson in how we should view society and systems of power. It reminded us that no matter how secure we feel in our daily routines, there's always something lurking in the shadows, something that can change the course of our lives in ways we can't even imagine. And as the city of Paris moved on, that case remained etched in the collective memory, not only as a solved crime, but as a reminder that deep down, we're all pawns in a larger game that we often don't fully understand. Now that you know the details of the mystery behind the poisoned letters, I wonder, how would you react if you were caught up in a plot where the lives of everyone around you were at stake and the rules were set by someone operating in the shadows? Are we truly safe in our daily routines? The case teaches us that often the most dangerous things lie not in the obvious threats but in those lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. But most importantly, what will you do with the knowledge you've gained today? Are you ready to question appearances and look at the world more attentively, more critically? Leave your answers in the comments and share this mystery with anyone you think needs to understand how power can be manipulated. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to continue learning about cases as intriguing as this one. With each new video, you'll be challenged to see the world through different eyes. Until the next mystery.